The promise of the American West was a lie. It wasn't a promise of gold or land. It was a brutal test of subtraction. It took your warmth, your food, your hope, and finally it took the people you trusted. For Clara May Thompson, it took the man who swore to protect her. Sterling Prescott looked at her petite frame, her delicate hands, and called her a china doll too fragile for this world. He left her for dead beside a broken wagon wheel as the first snows of 1876 began to fall in the Wyoming Territory. He thought her story would end there, a footnote buried under the frost. But he never counted on the man watching from the pines, a silent, giant Apache warrior who saw not a fragile doll, but a spirit of stubborn, unbreakable fire. The cold was a living thing. It wasn't just in the air. It was a predator that had slithered into the marrow of Clara May Thompson's bones. For 3 days, it had been her only constant companion since the wagon train, or what was left of it, had pushed on without her. It had all happened so fast, yet the memory played in her mind on a slow, torturous loop. The sickening crack of the axle on their Conestoga wagon, a sound like a giant snapping a bone. The other families gaunt and grim-faced, offering their sympathies but not their space. The early, unnatural blizzard that swept down from the Bighorn Mountains, choking the passes and stealing the last vestiges of warmth. And then there was Sterling Prescott, with his polished Boston accent that had once sounded like poetry and now grated like stones in a tin cup. He had courted her with promises of a sprawling ranch under a sky so big it would humble the soul. He'd praised her delicate beauty, comparing her to a rare porcelain figurine. Now that same delicacy was her damnation. "Clara May, you must be practical," he'd said, his breath pluming white in the frigid air. His eyes, the color of a winter sky, refused to meet hers. He was looking at the horizon, at the future he wanted a future she was apparently too small to fit into. "Practical Sterling, my home is in this wagon. Everything I own." She started, her voice trembling, not just from the cold. "And the wagon is broken. The axle is split clean through. Mr. Abernathy said it would take a week to fix a week we don't have. The snow is already a foot deep. They're leaving. We have to leave. Then we walk with them," she pleaded, clutching the thin wool of his coat. "I can keep up. I'm stronger than I look." He finally looked at her then, and the pity in his gaze was worse than any anger. He gently pried her fingers from his coat. "Clara, be honest. You stumbled 3 times yesterday on flat ground. You weigh next to nothing. This isn't a stroll through Beacon Hill. This is survival. You'll slow me down. You'll slow us down until we're both frozen corpses." Each word was a hammer blow, shattering the fragile picture of the life they were supposed to build together. He wasn't saying we anymore. He was saying me. You are leaving me." The question was a whisper, a puff of disbelief in the wind. He sighed, a sound of profound inconvenience. He ran a hand through his perfectly coiffed hair. "I am being a realist. I will go on with the others to Fort Laramie. I'll get established, and once the pass is clear in the spring, I will send for you. Or send someone back to check." They both knew it was a lie. Spring was a lifetime away. A lone woman with a broken wagon and meager supplies was a death sentence. He was giving her a more palatable version of the truth. He was choosing his life over hers. He saw her as a liability, a weight tied to his ankle as he tried to swim for shore. A china doll to be left on the shelf when the house was burning down. He unhitched their one remaining horse, a sturdy bay named Bess. He packed a single bag with the last of the salted pork, a bag of hardtack, and his rifle. He didn't look at her as he did it. He couldn't. "Sterling, please," she begged, tears freezing on her cheeks. "Don't do this." We took a vow. We are not yet married. "Clara May," he said, his voice cold and final. He swung himself into the saddle. "It is a cruel world. It demands cruel choices. Try to stay warm." And with that, he rode away, merging into the swirling snow, leaving her with the snapped axle, a handful of flour, a half-empty crate of her mother's medical herbs, and the echoing silence of his betrayal. The silence was the worst part. It was vast, absolute, broken only by the mournful howl of the wind through the pines and the creak of the broken wagon. She stood there until she could no longer feel her feet, a small, solitary figure in an endless canvas of white. He had called her too small, too weak. For the first time in her life, huddled in the freezing dark of the wagon that was now her tomb, Clara May Thompson believed him. She wrapped herself in every blanket she owned, her shivering so violent it felt like her skeleton was trying to tear its way out. Her world had shrunk to this tiny frozen space, and she was sure it was where she would die. The first 48 hours were a blur of shivering and despair. Clara rationed her flour, mixing it with snow to make a tasteless, gluey paste that did little to quiet the gnawing emptiness in her stomach. She burned broken pieces of a crate to create a pitiful, short-lived fire inside the wagon, the smoke stinging her eyes and offering little warmth. The world outside was an impressionist painting of white and grey, the trees bowed low under the weight of the snow, the mountains invisible behind the ceaseless curtain of flakes. She felt her strength waning. Her movements became slow, her thoughts thick and sluggish. She spent most of her time huddled under the blankets, drifting in and out of a listless sleep. The image of Sterling riding away burned into her mind. He was right. She was a doll meant for a warm parlor. Not for this. On the third morning, the snow stopped. The silence that followed was even more profound. The world was pristine, beautiful, and utterly indifferent to her plight. Pushing open the stiff canvas flap of the wagon, she looked out onto a landscape that had been remade. The sun was a pale, watery disk in a silver sky, and the light reflecting off the snow was blinding. Hunger, a sharp and vicious beast, was now her master. The flour paste wasn't enough. She knew she had to do something, or the cold would claim her within another day. Remembering tales from her grandfather about trapping, she spent an hour clumsily trying to fashion a snare from a bit of twine and a bent twig. It was a pathetic attempt. Her fingers were numb, her mind clouded. She set it near a thicket of bushes, praying for a rabbit stupid enough to blunder into it. Hours passed. Nothing. The hope that had flickered within her began to die, replaced by a cold, leaden certainty. She was just delaying the inevitable. As dusk began to bleed purple and orange across the western sky, she stumbled back toward the wagon defeated. And then she saw it. Lying on the snow-covered stump she used as a step to get into the wagon was a rabbit. It was plump, its neck clearly and cleanly broken. It hadn't been there an hour ago. She looked around wildly, her heart hammering against her ribs. The snow was a perfect unbroken sheet, except for her own tracks, and a single straight line of massive footprints leading from the edge of the forest to the stump and then back again. They were too large to be hers, and they were barefoot or moccasined. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through her hunger-fueled haze. She wasn't alone. Someone was watching her. An Indian. The stories told around the wagon train campfires came rushing back, tales of savage warriors of raids and unspeakable violence. She scrambled into the wagon, her hands shaking as she fumbled for the small skinning knife that was part of her meager kitchen supplies. She sat in the dark, knife clutched in her hand, listening. But there was only the wind. All night she stayed awake, her ears straining for the sound of a snapped twig, a soft footfall. Nothing came. By dawn, hunger had overpowered fear. The rabbit was still there. It was a gift, a miracle, but one that came from a terrifying, unknown source. With trembling hands, she took it. She knew how to skin and dress an animal. Her father had taught her the basics years ago. Soon the scent of roasting meat filled the small space of the wagon, a smell so intoxicating it made her dizzy. It was the most delicious meal she had ever tasted. It was the taste of life. The next day, a brace of grouse appeared in the same spot. The day after, a fish stiffly frozen lay beside the stump. Her mysterious benefactor never showed himself. He was a ghost, a presence felt, but not seen. She started to look for him, her eyes scanning the dense line of pine and fir trees that bordered the small clearing. She would catch a flicker of movement, a shadow that didn't belong, and then it would be gone. He was there. He was watching. The fear began to subside, replaced by a profound and bewildering curiosity. This was not the behavior of the savage boogeyman from the campfire stories. This was care. Deliberate, silent, and life-saving. One afternoon, while gathering fallen branches for her fire, she slipped on a patch of ice, hidden beneath the snow. Her ankle twisted with a sickening crunch, and a bolt of pure agony shot up her leg. She cried out, collapsing into the snow, the world whitening at the edges of her vision. She tried to stand, but the pain was blinding. She was helpless a mile from her wagon with a broken ankle as the temperature began its nightly plummet. Panic seized her. This was it. This was how it would end. She would freeze to death yards from the only shelter she had. She lay there for what felt like an hour, shivering uncontrollably, when a shadow fell over her. She looked up, her vision blurry with tears of pain and fear. He was immense, taller than any man she had ever seen, with shoulders as broad as an ox yoke. His skin was the color of rich, dark copper, and his long black hair was held back by a simple leather band. He wore buckskin leggings and a heavy buffalo hide robe. His face was a mask of stoicism, high cheekbones, and a strong jaw, but his eyes were dark and deep, and they held an expression she couldn't read. It wasn't pity, not exactly. It was a look of intense, quiet assessment. He knelt beside her, his movements fluid and silent. He was the source of the footprints, the provider of the food, her silent guardian. He gestured to her ankle. She could only nod, biting her lip to keep from crying out again. Without a word, he scooped her into his arms as if she weighed nothing at all. One arm supported her back, the other cradled her legs. She was enveloped in the scent of pine leather and wood smoke. It was a smell of pure wilderness. For the first time since Sterling had left, she felt a strange, impossible sense of safety. As he carried her back toward the wagon, she finally understood. She had been left for being too small, but she had been found by a giant. The Apache warrior, for she could only assume his tribe from his appearance, based on the hushed descriptions from the wagon train, scouts moved with an economy of motion that was mesmerizing. He laid her gently inside the wagon on her bedroll of blankets, his touch surprisingly careful for a man of his size and strength. Clara, despite the throbbing pain in her ankle, felt her mind sharpen. Her mother had been an herbalist, a woman who believed God put a cure for every ailment in the soil. She had passed much of that knowledge to Clara, who had always treated it as a quaint hobby. Now it was all she had. "Willow bark," she said, her voice raspy. The warrior paused, turning his head slightly. His gaze was unnervingly direct. For the pain, she explained, pointing to a small labeled canvas sack in the crate of herbs, and comfrey root for the break. It needs to be made into a poultice." He looked at the sack, then back at her. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. Without another word, he located the sack, took her small cooking pot, and disappeared outside. While he was gone, Clara tore strips from a spare petticoat to use as bandages. The pain was a nauseating wave, but the focus of the task helped to keep it at bay. He returned with snow melted into water, which he set to boil over her small fire. He chewed a piece of the willow bark himself, first a quick cautionary taste, before grinding the rest with a stone and adding it to the hot water to steep. He handed her the bitter, steaming tea in her tin cup. Then he prepared the comfrey root, crushing it into a thick, dark paste. His hands were large, calloused and scarred, but they were remarkably deft. He examined her ankle with a detached, clinical focus, his fingers probing gently to find the exact location of the break. She flinched, but he held her gaze with his own, a silent command to be still. He set the bone with a swift, expert twist that made her gasp, sweat beading on her forehead. He then applied the warm, comfrey poultice, its earthy smell filling the wagon, and bound the ankle tightly with the strips of her petticoat and 2 flat pieces of wood he'd whittled into splints. The entire process was conducted in absolute silence. It was a form of communication more profound than any words they could have shared. It was a pact sealed in action. He was offering his strength and knowledge of the wild. She was offering her knowledge of healing. They were 2 solitary people forging an alliance against the indifference of the wilderness. He stayed through the night, sitting on an overturned crate just inside the wagon's flap, a silent, imposing silhouette against the moonlit snow. He kept the fire-fed his presence, a solid wall against the terror of the dark. Clara, her pain dulled by the willow bark tea, and the warmth of the fire, slept for the first time without fear. Over the next few days, a routine formed. He would appear at dawn, leaving fresh game. He would check her splint, his expression unreadable, and then vanish back into the trees. His name was a mystery. His story was a closed book. She tried speaking to him once. "Thank you," she said, her voice feeling loud in the quiet space between them. "I don't know what I would have done." He simply looked at her, his dark eyes, holding hers for a long moment, and then gave the same slow nod he had before. It seemed to be his primary form of acknowledgement. She decided not to press. Words felt clumsy and inadequate to hear. One morning, nearly a week after her injury, he didn't just leave food. He arrived carrying a primitive but effective crutch he had fashioned from a forked branch. He gestured for her to try it. Leaning on his steady arm for support, she managed to pull herself up. The crutch was a perfect fit. For the first time in days, she was able to move outside the confines of the wagon, hopping awkwardly into the crisp, clean air. It was then that she noticed he wasn't just hunting. He had been working. A short distance from her wagon, in a small clearing sheltered by a granite rock face, a structure was beginning to take shape. He had felled several pine trees using a simple hand axe she hadn't even known he possessed. He had stripped them of their branches and was now notching the ends with incredible precision. He was building a cabin. The realization struck her with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't a temporary arrangement. This silent giant man wasn't just keeping her alive until spring. He was building her a home. He was building them a fortress against the wilderness. She limped over to him, leaning heavily on her crutch. He was lifting a massive log into place, muscles cording in his back and arms. He moved it with the ease of a man lifting a fence post. He set it down, fitting the notches together perfectly, and then turned to face her. She had no words. What could she say? He was a complete stranger, a man from a world utterly alien to her own, and he was expending this colossal effort for her. He looked at her then, at the half-built cabin, then back at her. He finally spoke. His voice was a low rumble, like stones shifting deep underground. It was the first word he had ever said to her. Nokona. He pointed to his own chest, then he pointed at her. She understood. Clara, she said, her voice barely a whisper. Clara May Thompson. He nodded. Nokona. The name felt ancient and powerful. He turned back to his work, lifting another log. The unspoken pact had been given a name, and with every log he laid, Nokona was building more than just a cabin. He was building a future she never could have imagined. The cabin rose from the snow-covered ground with astonishing speed. Nokona worked from the first light of dawn until the last vestiges of twilight faded from the sky. He was a master craftsman, using only his axe and knife and the raw materials the forest provided. Clara watched, mesmerized, as he dovetailed the corners of the logs so tightly that not even a knife blade could be slipped between them. He chinked the gaps with a mixture of mud moss and dried grass that hardened into a cement-like seal against the wind. Her role in the construction was small but vital. Hobbling on her crutch, she directed her efforts toward making the interior a home. She used her knowledge of herbs not just for medicine, but for comfort. She gathered pine needles to strew on the packed earth floor, releasing a clean, sharp scent. She found dried yarrow and lavender in her mother's crate, sewing them into small sachets to tuck into their bedrolls. Nokona built a stone fireplace in one wall, a masterpiece of dry stacking that drew smoke perfectly up and out through a carefully constructed chimney. The first time he lit a fire in it, the warm, steady glow pushed back the oppressive gloom of the Wyoming winter and filled the small one-room cabin with a sense of profound security. This was their space, a space they had carved out of the wilderness together. As her ankle healed, their silent partnership deepened into a comfortable rhythm. They rarely spoke, but they communicated constantly. A shared glance across the fire, a gesture of a hand, a small nod, these were the words of their shared language. She learned that he preferred the taste of rabbit over squirrel, that he took his tea unsweetened, that he had a small, almost imperceptible scar above his left eye that tensed when he was concentrating. He in turn learned her patterns. He saw the way she would hum softly to herself while mending a tear in her dress. He noticed that she always saved the best piece of meat for him. He watched with a quiet intensity as she carefully tended to the small, withered geranium she had salvaged from the wagon, the last living link to her old life in Boston. Her gentle care for the fragile plant seemed to fascinate him. Life became simple, but not easy. They worked constantly. Nokona taught her how to set proper traps, how to read animal tracks in the snow, and which berries were safe to eat. Clara used her limited supplies with ingenuity, turning tough game into savory stews seasoned with wild onions and thyme she found on a sun-facing slope. They were a self-contained unit, a world of two against the vast, empty landscape. Once her ankle was strong enough to bear her weight, they made their first trip to the nearest sign of civilization, the fledgling town of Redemption, a day's ride away. Nokona had managed to catch and tame 2 wild mustangs, and he rode with the quiet confidence of a man born to the saddle. Clara, riding beside him, felt a nervous flutter in her stomach. Redemption was little more than a muddy street, lined with a dozen false-fronted buildings, a general store, a saloon, a blacksmith, and a sheriff's office. As they rode in, a hush fell over the few prospectors and trappers loitering on the boardwalks. Doors creaked open. Faces appeared in windows. Their gazes were hard, suspicious, and filled with a casual animosity that was chilling. They stared at Clara, a white woman, dressed in a patched but clean dress, riding alongside a towering Apache warrior. but most of their venom was reserved for Nokona. Silas Kane, the owner of the saloon and most of the land in the valley, stepped out onto the boardwalk. He was a big man running to fat with a florid face and small, greedy eyes. He rested his hands on his expansive belly, a gold watch chain stretched taut across his vest. Well now, Kane boomed, his voice dripping with false geniality. "Look what the wind blew in. Don't see many of your kind around here anymore, Chief. Thought the army cleaned most of you out." Nokona's face remained a stone mask. He stared straight ahead, his hands resting on his thighs, his posture relaxed, but radiating a quiet, lethal energy. He completely ignored Kane. Clara felt a surge of protective anger. She slid off her horse, her back straight. "We've come to the general store," she said, her voice clearer and stronger than she expected. "We have pelts to trade for flour and salt." Kane's eyes slid over to her, his gaze dismissive and insulting. He looked her up and down from her worn boots to her determined face. "Is that so, you keeping interesting company, little lady? Ought to be careful. Some things rub off." Inside the general store, the proprietor, a weaselly man named Peterson, served them with grudging reluctance, his eyes constantly darting toward Nokona as if expecting him to scalp him over a bag of beans. He triple-checked the quality of their beaver and fox pelts, trying to shortchange them on the trade, until Clara, with a calm but firm command of arithmetic, corrected his figures. They left Redemption with their meager supplies and the palpable weight of the town's hostility on their shoulders. The ride back was silent. The peace of their hidden valley felt more precious than ever. That night, as a blizzard raged outside, blanketing the world in a fury of white, they sat by the fire. The cabin was an island of warmth and safety. For the first time, Clara reached out and gently touched the back of Nokona's hand. He didn't pull away. His skin was warm and rough against hers. "This is my home now," she said softly. Nokona looked from her face to their joined hands, and then into the dancing flames. He gave a single, slow nod. But this time, a corner of his mouth tilted upwards just for a second. It wasn't a smile, not quite. It was something smaller, rarer, and infinitely more meaningful. It was an admission. It was his home, too. Spring arrived in the valley like a long-held breath finally released. The snow receded, revealing a carpet of green shoots and vibrant wildflowers. The creek, which had been frozen solid, now gurgled with life, its water cold and clear. Clara's geranium, which she had carefully nursed through the winter, produced a single brilliant red blossom. For Clara and Nokona, it was a time of quiet joy and shared labor, reinforcing the foundations of the life they had built. They were repairing a section of fence for a small corral when they heard the sound of an approaching horse. It was an unfamiliar rhythm, confident and brisk. Nokona stiffened his hand, moving instinctively to the knife at his belt. He shaded his eyes, looking down the narrow track that led into their valley. A lone rider emerged from the trees. He was dressed in fine new clothes, a tailored jacket, clean trousers, and polished riding boots. He sat atop a magnificent black stallion with a silver inlaid saddle. As he drew closer, the sun caught his face, and Clara's blood ran cold. It was Sterling Prescott. He looked prosperous, healthy, and utterly pleased with himself. The gaunt, desperate man who had abandoned her was gone, replaced by a picture of success. He reined in his horse a few yards away, his gaze sweeping over the scene before him, the sturdy cabin, the tidy corral, the smoke curling from the chimney, and Clara standing beside the imposing figure of Nokona. A look of complete and utter astonishment crossed Sterling's face, quickly replaced by a carefully constructed mask of charming relief. "Clara May!" he exclaimed, swinging down from his horse. "My God, I don't believe it." You're alive, I prayed. I prayed every night that I would find you. He strode toward her, his arms open, a dazzling smile on his face. Clara stood frozen, a block of ice, in the warm spring sun. All the pain, all the fear, all the lonely nights of her winter ordeal came rushing back. This man was a ghost, and he had no right to haunt her new life. She took a step back, and his smile faltered for a fraction of a second. Nokona moved not aggressively, but placing himself slightly in front of her. It was a subtle protective gesture, as clear a statement as shouting. Sterling's eyes flickered to Nokona, a sneer touching his lips. He dismissed him as one would a piece of furniture, and focused back on Clara. Clara, who is this person? He asked, his tone laced with condescension. You must have been so frightened. I came back as soon as I could. I made a small fortune in the gold fields near Deadwood. I came back to rescue you, my love, just as I promised. You didn't promise to rescue me, Clara said, her voice dangerously quiet. You promised to send someone to check. You left me to die, Sterling. He had the grace to look momentarily abashed. It was a terrible choice, the hardest of my life. But it was for the best, don't you see? If I had stayed, we both would have perished. I went on. I built a foundation for our future. It was all for you. He was a masterful liar. He painted his cowardice as a noble sacrifice. He looked at the cabin with disdain. You've been living like this, in this hovel, with him. He gestured toward Nokona. Clara, this is beneath you. I have a room at the finest hotel in Cheyenne. I have purchased a plot for our ranch, the one we dreamed of. Come with me. Pack your things. Leave this primitive existence behind. Nokona remained silent, his dark eyes fixed on Sterling. He understood little of the man's words, but he understood his intent perfectly. He saw the possessiveness in his eyes, the dismissive wave of his hand, the way he looked at Clara, as if she were a lost pocket watch he had come to reclaim. This primitive existence saved my life, Clara said, finding her strength. This hovel is the only real home I have ever known. And this man she put a hand on, Nokona's arm, a gesture of unwavering solidarity, is not a person. His name is Nokona, and he is more of a man than you could ever be. Sterling's charming facade finally cracked. His face hardened, the pleasant blue of his eyes turning to chips of ice. Have you lost your mind? Look at him. He's a savage, a wild animal. What has he done to you? You are coming with me, Clara May. You are my betrothed. We have an understanding. The only thing I understand is that you broke every promise you ever made, she shot back. You are a stranger to me. This is my home. You are not welcome here. Please leave. Sterling stared at her, his jaw tight with fury and disbelief. He had clearly expected her to fall into his arms, grateful for her rescue. He had underestimated her just as he always had. He looked from her defiant face to Nokona's unmoving form. He saw the cabin a symbol of permanence he could not breach. He was a man used to getting his way, and this rejection was an intolerable insult. You will regret this. Clara May, he said, his voice low and menacing. You belong in the civilized world, not in the dirt with him. I won't allow you to throw your life away. He turned without another word, mounted his magnificent horse, and galloped away, his anger a palpable force trailing in his wake. Clara watched him go, her body trembling with adrenaline. The confrontation was over, but she knew with a sinking feeling in her stomach that this was not the end. Sterling Prescott was not a man who accepted defeat. He was a ghost from her past, and he had returned not to save her, but to haunt her, and to destroy the one good thing she had built in this harsh, unforgiving land. The peace of their valley had been shattered. The peace of their valley was a fragile thing, and it was shattered just 2 days after Sterling's departure. The sound of approaching horses sent Nokona to the edge of the trees, his body tense and watchful, while Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. It was Sheriff Brody from Redemption, but he was not alone. Beside him, riding with the smug assurance of a man who owned the world, was Silas Kane. Sterling Prescott was nowhere to be seen, but his venomous influence was a palpable poison in the air. The sheriff, a weary man, whose face was a roadmap of moral compromises, had the decency to look uncomfortable. He avoided looking at Nokona, keeping his gaze fixed on Clara. Kane, however, sized up their home with a greedy, dismissive sneer. Ma'am Sheriff Brody began stopping his horse a respectful distance away. "I'm afraid I have an official matter to attend to. A formal complaint has been filed by Mr. Sterling Prescott. He alleges that you, a citizen of the United States, are being held here against your will by this native." The accusation was so vile, so twisted, that it stole Clara's breath. "That is a despicable lie," she managed, her voice trembling with a sudden hot fury. "This man saved my life." Kane laughed, a thick, unpleasant sound. "That ain't the only matter, Sheriff. The complaint gave me cause to check my deeds." He produced a rolled document from his saddlebag with a theatrical flourish. "According to the Territorial Surveyor's Office, this entire valley, including this plot with its charming little shack, falls within the boundaries of my property, duly filed and legally registered." He held Clara's gaze, his small eyes glinting with malice. "You're squatters." "This land was empty," Clara protested, her mind reeling. "No one was here. We built this from nothing. Empty land in my valley belongs to me." Little Lady Kane said, his voice oozing false authority. "The law in a place like this was not a shield for the weak, but a cudgel for the powerful. I'm a generous man, so I'll give you 10 days. You and your pet Indian clear out. After that, we'll clear you out ourselves." He then turned his full attention to Nokona, who had remained as still and silent as the granite cliff behind him. "As for you, the only good place for your kind is on a reservation or in a grave. You'd be wise to choose the reservation." Sheriff Brody cleared his throat, a sound of profound unease. "The law is the law, ma'am. That paper is official. I'm advising you to pack up and move on. For your own safety." They left, wheeling their horses around and riding away, leaving the eviction notice, a cruel, formal piece of paper tossed onto the ground. Clara stared at it, a symbol of a world that would not only allow a man like Sterling to abandon her, but would then help him destroy the life she had built in his absence. A cold fury began to bloom in her chest, crowding out the fear. "They think I'm still that fragile doll," she whispered to Nokona after they were gone. "They think they can just push us away." Nokona picked up the paper, glanced at the strange markings he couldn't read, and then looked at the cabin, at the tightly notched logs, the solid stone fireplace, the home he had raised from the forest floor. He crumpled the notice in his massive fist. His reply was a single, quiet declaration that resonated with the force of an oath: "We stay." The next 10 days were not spent in fear, but in a fever of grim preparation. The valley transformed from a sanctuary into a fortress. Nokona was no longer a builder. He was a warrior, his every movement precise and purposeful. He walked the perimeter with Clara, showing her the strategic advantages of their location, the granite cliff that made a rear assault impossible, the narrow mouth of the valley that created a natural choke point, the dense woods of aspen and pine that provided perfect cover. His most important task was teaching Clara to shoot the rifle Sterling had so carelessly left behind. The weapon was heavy and awkward in her hands, a brutal piece of machinery. The first time she fired it, the recoil slammed into her shoulder like a mule's kick, knocking her back a step and sending a shockwave through her small frame. But she did not complain. She set her jaw, listened to Nokona's patient, non-verbal instructions, a shift of her stance, a slight adjustment of her grip, and fired again. And again. She practiced until her shoulder was a tapestry of purple and blue bruises, until the motions of loading and aiming became second nature, until she could consistently hit a knot on a pine tree 50 yards away. While Nokona focused on weapons, Clara used her own skills for defense. She gathered lengths of vine, and using tins from their dwindling supplies, fashioned a network of tripwires and noisemakers around the cabin's perimeter. She dug shallow pits along the main approach, which Nokona then filled with fire-hardened, sharpened stakes, camouflaging them with a delicate covering of leaves and branches. There was a grim satisfaction in the work. Every trap she set, every bullet she practiced with, was a defiance of Sterling's judgment of her. He had deemed her too weak to survive. Now she was preparing to wage a war. On the 11th day, under a sky the color of lead, they came. It wasn't just Kane and his saloon thugs. Sterling had used his deadwood gold to hire a half-dozen gunslingers, hard-faced men with the dead eyes of predators who killed for coin. They rode into the valley slowly, an arrogant procession, their confidence a palpable insult. They clearly expected to find a terrified woman and a lone Indian who would run at the first sign of trouble. Last chance, Thompson Kane bellowed from the edge of the clearing, his voice echoing in the tense silence. "Send the woman out. We don't have to kill you, Redskin." The only answer was the wind whispering through the pines. Then a single rifle cracked, not from the cabin, but from the dense aspen grove on the valley's eastern slope. One of the hired guns cried out a strangled yelp of shock and tumbled from his saddle with a shattered shoulder. Chaos erupted. Nokona, using the guerrilla tactics of his ancestors, had become a ghost of smoke and death among the trees. The men spurred their horses forward, firing a volley of lead into the walls of the cabin. Inside, Clara felt the thud of the bullets, striking the logs like angry fists. Wood splintered around the small window. She peered through, but she held her ground. She rested the heavy barrel on the sill, took a calming breath, as Nokona had taught her, ignored the men on horseback, and aimed for the largest, most disruptive target, Silas Kane's horse. She squeezed the trigger. The horse screamed a piercing sound of animal agony and collapsed, pinning Kane's leg beneath its great weight. The entire attack faltered. A second shot rang out from the trees, and another gunslinger clutched his leg, cursing, as he fought to control his spooked mount. Sterling, who had been observing from a safe position in the rear, saw his organized assault dissolving into a panicked firefight. "He's just one man," he screamed, his voice high and thin. "Rush the cabin. Get the woman." Driven by fury and humiliation, he spurred his magnificent black stallion forward, leading the charge himself. Clara saw him coming, a vision of misplaced arrogance. The man who had called her a doll was now galloping toward her, with the intent to kill. The cold fury inside her solidified into ice. She reloaded the movements, now swift and certain. She didn't aim for Sterling. She aimed for the ground, directly in front of his charging horse. The bullet kicked up a plume of dirt and rock. The high-strung stallion, already unnerved by the gunfire, reared violently. Sterling, a drawing-room gentleman playing at being a frontiersman, was thrown from his silver-inlaid saddle. He landed with a wet smack in a patch of mud, his grand charge ending in a heap of abject humiliation. The fight ground down into a desperate siege. The remaining gunmen took cover, trading sporadic shots with the two defenders. One man, trying to circle around through the brush, blundered into one of Clara's tripwires. The clatter of tin cans gave away his position, and Nokona's next shot sent him scrambling back with a flesh wound in his arm. As dusk began to bleed purple across the sky, a new, more sinister threat emerged. Under the cover of the growing darkness, one of Cain's men crawled forward, a lit torch in his hand. They were going to burn them out. Nokona saw the flicker of flame. There was no more time for tactics, no more room for ghosts. With a fearsome cry that echoed off the granite cliff, a cry of pure primal rage, he broke cover. He charged from the trees, not with a rifle, but with a hatchet in one hand and a knife in the other. He moved with a terrifying speed and ferocity, a blur of muscle and buckskin, an elemental force of retribution. The gunmen who had been fighting a phantom were now faced with a flesh-and-blood demon, their courage shattered. The man with the torch dropped it and ran for his life. The others scrambled for their horses, firing blindly behind them as they fled the valley in a full-blown panic. In moments, the valley was quiet again. The siege was over. But the man who had started it all was still there. Sterling Prescott, his fine clothes ruined, was crawling through the mud, his face a mask of pathetic terror as he tried to escape the warrior who now stood over him. Nokona put out the grass fire with a few swift stomps of his moccasined feet before turning his attention to the men they had wounded. He was not a man of senseless cruelty. He disarmed them, used their own bandanas to apply crude tourniquets, and pointed them toward the road to redemption. "Go," he commanded the single word, carrying the weight of a death sentence should they ever return. They scrambled to obey, helping their moaning comrades, their arrogance replaced by a healthy dose of fear. Silas Cain, still trapped under his dead horse, blustered and threatened until Nokona walked over, lifted the horse's flank just enough for Cain to slide his leg out, and then let it drop with a ground-shaking thud. Cain stared at the effortless display of strength, his face pale. He said nothing more as he limped away after his men. That left only Sterling. He was backed against a tree, his eyes wide with terror, as Nokona approached, the bloody hatchet still in his hand. Sterling looked from the Apache warrior to Clara, who was now standing on the cabin's porch, the rifle held loosely in her hands. "Clara, for God's sake, call him off," he pleaded, his voice a pathetic whine. "He's a savage. He'll kill me." Clara walked slowly toward him, her footsteps steady on the damp earth. She stopped a few feet away, looking at the man she once thought she loved. The mud-stained, terrified creature before her bore no resemblance to the charming suitor from Boston or the successful speculator from Deadwood. This was the real Sterling Prescott, a hollow man built of cowardice and vanity. A savage, she repeated, her voice cold and even. "The man who saved me when you left me to die. The man who built me a home with his bare hands while you were lining your pockets with gold. The man who just risked his life to defend that home from the thugs you hired." She looked at Nokona, who stood impassive, waiting. She had seen him fight with the ferocity of a wolf, but now he was simply watching her. He was leaving this final reckoning to her. This was her ghost to exorcise. She turned back to Sterling. "You didn't come back for me. You came back for a possession you thought you had misplaced. When you found out it was no longer yours, you decided to break it. You called me a china doll, Sterling. You were right about one thing. I was fragile. But this place, this hard, beautiful, unforgiving land, it burns away the fragility. Or it shatters you. Look at us, Sterling. Which one of us is shattered?" He had no answer. He just stared at her, his mouth agape. The woman he was looking at was not the timid, agreeable girl he had abandoned. Her eyes held the hardness of mountain granite. Her small frame seemed to radiate a strength that dwarfed his own. "Get on your horse, Sterling," she said, her voice flat. "Ride out of this valley and never come back. Don't go to Cheyenne. Don't go to Deadwood. Go back east. Go back to your parlors and your poetry. You are not built for this world. You are too small." She threw his own words back at him, and they struck him with more force than any physical blow. The humiliation was total. He scrambled to his feet, found his terrified horse, and hauled himself into the saddle. He gave her one last look, a mixture of hatred, fear, and disbelief, and then spurred the animal into a gallop, fleeing the valley and the woman he had so grievously underestimated. Clara watched until he was gone, the sound of his horse's hooves fading into the twilight. A deep, shuddering breath escaped her. It was over. All of it. The past was finally buried. She turned to Nokona. He had put away his weapons and was looking at her, his dark eyes filled with a profound, quiet pride. The mask of the stoic warrior was gone, replaced by something softer, something unguarded. He stepped toward her, closing the space between them. He gently took the heavy rifle from her hands and set it aside. Then he raised his large, calloused hand and cupped her cheek, his thumb stroking away a smudge of gunpowder. It was a gesture of incredible tenderness. "Clara May Thompson," he said, speaking her full name for the first time. His voice was a low, warm rumble. "You are not small." Tears welled in her eyes, not of sorrow, but of release. She leaned into his touch, her hand coming up to rest over his. The sun had set, and in the quiet dark of the valley, they had fought for the valley they had made their own. She was finally home. They stood there for a long time, two survivors, two partners, their silent pact, now sealed by the fire of conflict and the certainty of a shared future, whatever it may hold. In the quiet corners of the American West, history isn't just written in the grand deeds of famous men, but in the silent resilience of people like Clara and Nokona. Theirs is a story that reminds us that strength isn't measured in physical size, but in the courage of the heart. It shows us that home isn't just a place you find, but something you build with your own hands, and that family can be forged in the most unlikely of alliances. They were two outcasts discarded by their respective worlds who found in each other the one thing they both needed, a reason to stand and fight. Their cabin stood for decades, a quiet monument to a love born not of flowery words, but of shared hardship and unspoken understanding. If this story of survival courage and the powerful bonds of the human spirit moved you, please take a moment to click the like button below. Share it with someone who loves a true tale from the heart of the Old West. And most importantly, subscribe to our channel for more stories like this. We have so many more forgotten histories to share with you. Thank you for listening.